I first noticed her the moment I stepped into the study hall, though I'm not sure if noticed even begins to describe it. The air seemed to thicken around her, like gravity had shifted just enough to pull me closer without a single word. She was arranging books on a shelf, tall and composed, her hair catching the soft overhead light, glinting between shades of chestnut and bronze. Everything about her moved with intention, slow, precise, deliberate, but there was a fragility in the way she exhaled, the faint pause before her hands slid across the book's spines, that made her human, approachable, almost painfully alive. I lingered by the doorway, pretending to search for a seat, but my eyes kept returning to her. There was a subtle elegance in her posture, shoulders slightly hunched as if protecting herself from the world, yet she radiated confidence that didn't need proclamation. And then she looked up. Our eyes met, longer than polite, shorter than intimate, but it was enough to make my stomach tighten. She tilted her head just slightly, studying me with curiosity threaded through something softer, almost teasing. My fingers itched to reach for the pen I'd forgotten, though I knew she wasn't offering. The space between us hummed. Every small sound, the scrape of a chair, the whisper of pages turning, felt amplified, charged, like the quiet before rain. I moved toward a table near the back, but she shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly, and the scent of her, warm, faintly floral, utterly her own, wafted across my senses. I swallowed, aware of how my heart seemed to stumble, not from attraction alone, but from the gravity of being noticed by someone who could see through the easy exterior I wore. When she passed my table, our hands brushed, lightly, a flicker of contact, and I froze. She didn't acknowledge it, didn't even glance my way, yet the memory of her touch lingered like a pulse I couldn't quiet. I dared a glance up, catching hers just for a heartbeat longer than necessary, and for the first time, I felt the weight of unspoken possibility. "Keep quiet, unless it's to me," she said softly, almost a whisper, and my throat went dry. The words weren't strict. They were intimate, a gentle claim in a room full of silence. I nodded, though my hands trembled slightly over my notebook. There was something in the way she said it, in the tilt of her lips, in the way her gaze lingered on mine, that made it feel like a secret just between us. I pretended to focus on my own notes, but the edges of my vision were alive with her movements, her fingers brushing against the spines of books, the soft rustle of fabric as she adjusted her cardigan, the almost imperceptible tension in her shoulders. Every gesture became a language I was desperate to understand, and yet, I was painfully aware of the boundary we hadn't crossed, yet. A sudden noise, a page dropping somewhere across the room, made her glance up, her eyes scanning before settling briefly on mine. That tiny flicker of attention was enough to make my chest pound. She smiled just slightly, an almost hidden curve, before returning to her books. But the moment lingered, charged, unfinished. And then, just as I thought I might lose my nerve entirely, the door to the study hall creaked open, cutting through the quiet, and someone stepped in. Her eyes flicked toward it, and in that instant, I felt the electricity between us hang in midair, waiting, unfinished, unresolved. The day after that first glance, I found myself arriving early to the study hall. Not for the quiet, not for the books, but for her, the way she moved through the stacks as though she belonged to a world I wasn't allowed into, yet desperately wanted to. I had learned, over years of quiet observation, how loneliness etches itself into the smallest details. She always lingered near the history section, her fingers brushing titles as if she could absorb lives through their pages. There was a light in her eyes that spoke of past disappointments, of connections that never stayed. Sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, I caught the way her shoulders slumped ever so slightly, the brief exhale of someone carrying weight no one else could see. I, too, carried a kind of solitude, the hum of a life still trying to find its rhythm. Friends came and went, flirtations faded into awkward laughter. But she moved through the room like gravity, unavoidable and absolute. And I had learned quickly that my attention betrayed me. A glance too long, a hand brushing a notebook closer, a pen I fumbled, each tiny act a confession I could not control. It wasn't just the age gap, though that made my pulse quicken in ways that felt both thrilling and wrong. I noticed the subtle lines on her hands, the faint gray threaded through her hair, the way her voice carried the weight of years I had yet to live. And she noticed me, I could tell, though she carried it with restraint. There was the faintest hesitation in her steps when she approached my table, a measured grace that suggested awareness, self-control, and, perhaps, desire restrained. She leaned over once, ostensibly to reach for a book on the table behind me, and her hair brushed my cheek. I could feel the warmth of her breath as she murmured a title, almost too soft for me to hear. My hand twitched, half-formed impulse to touch hers, to linger where our worlds intersected. She straightened, but the pause, the way her fingers hovered over mine for just a second longer than necessary, left a lingering heat, a quiet acknowledgement neither of us spoke aloud. In conversation, she was careful, polite, but there were moments when the mask slipped. A laugh too soft, a glance too slow, a hand brushing the edge of my notebook, accidentally, as she handed it back. I hated myself for noticing every imperceptible movement, yet I could not stop. And perhaps she noticed my notice, because there were moments when she lingered, standing just a fraction too close, letting the warmth of her body fill the space between us, but always retreating before I could reach for more. There was tension in that give and take, a dance either of us had rehearsed. I wondered if she felt the same pull I did, or if I was constructing illusions from gestures that meant nothing. And yet, every subtle signal, the brush of her hand against my shoulder as she reached across the table, the faint tremor in her voice when she said my name, the way her eyes followed me when I scribbled notes, suggested otherwise. We were careful, fragile creatures tiptoeing around the boundary we both feared to cross. Social perception, the age difference, her position of quiet authority, all of it whispered that this was a desire to be restrained, hidden, controlled. And still, in the quiet of the room, our bodies betrayed us. That afternoon, I dared to linger at the edge of the shelves while she reached for a book just beyond my arm. My fingers brushed hers, not deliberately, though it felt deliberate enough, and I caught the faint intake of her breath. Her gaze met mine for just a heartbeat, and it was enough. Her eyes softened, a small, almost imperceptible smile curling the corner of her lips. No words passed between us, yet a connection deepened, electric and unspoken. We stayed like that for a long moment, suspended in the hum of the study hall, aware of the forbidden gravity that drew us together. Then she stepped back, straightened her cardigan, and said only, "Careful! You might get lost here." But even as she spoke, I knew neither of us would be able to forget the contact, the warmth, the pause, the small, dangerous spark that had just been lit. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of the study hall, casting narrow streaks of gold across the wooden tables. I sat near the edge of the shelves, pretending to organize my notes, though every line I wrote was interrupted by the faint sound of her steps behind me. She moved with that quiet authority, that effortless grace, yet there was something different today, hesitation, perhaps, or a deliberate slowness that made my pulse quicken. I felt her presence before I saw her. A subtle shift in the air, a warmth that settled behind me like sunlight on skin. She leaned over my shoulder, ostensibly to straighten a page I had left askew. Her breath brushed the back of my neck, and I had to swallow hard to keep my voice steady. My hand twitched, wanting to rest against hers, to trace the line of her fingers, but I didn't. "Not yet." "Careful," she murmured, her lips almost grazing my ear. "You're too close to the edge." I wanted to answer, to say something witty, something that would let her know I noticed everything, but my words died in my throat. I could feel the heat radiating from her shoulder, the subtle weight of her hand as it lingered near mine, and the room, usually so quiet, seemed suddenly loud. Then the door creaked. I stiffened. A voice called from the hallway, casual, oblivious. My heartbeat skipped, and she froze, her fingers retracting just enough to signal restraint. We both straightened, pretending to be absorbed in our own tasks, and I realized how fragile this small connection was. One interruption could expose everything we hadn't said, everything we hadn't done. Her gaze flicked to mine across the table, a brief, loaded glance, and I caught the almost imperceptible tilt of her lips, the flicker of a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was teasing, dangerous, and utterly intoxicating. I wanted to lean in, to close the distance, but guilt and fear held me back. The age difference, the unspoken rules of propriety, the idea that someone could walk in at any moment, it all pressed against my chest. We returned to our positions, yet the air between us pulsed with unspoken desire. I could feel the tension in every small movement, the brush of her sleeve as she adjusted her cardigan, the way her knee lightly bumped mine under the table, the lingering warmth of her hand as she returned a book to the shelf. Time fractured into short beats, glances, silences, half-smiles. My pulse roared in my ears every time she leaned a little closer, every time her hand almost touched mine. I caught my reflection in the window, my eyes locked on her, my body leaning involuntarily toward hers. She must have sensed it, because her chest rose and fell slightly faster, the faintest tremor in her fingers betraying her calm facade. I imagined leaning forward, closing the space, feeling the curve of her lips against mine, but before the thought could fully form, reality intruded. A cough echoed from the far end of the hall. My head whipped up. She recoiled just enough to break the dangerous proximity, her eyes meeting mine one last time with a mixture of desire and hesitation. And yet, when the moment passed, when the potential interruption was gone, we were still closer than ever. Our chairs had shifted imperceptibly, our knees brushing, our hands resting dangerously near. The air between us hummed with possibility, the unspoken promise of a touch neither of us dared to claim fully. She finally broke the silence, her voice low and measured. "Don't get used to this closeness." But her eyes betrayed her words. They stayed locked on mine longer than polite, and I realized, with a jolt, that neither of us was capable of pulling back entirely, not yet, not ever. The study hall was empty now, save for the two of us. The afternoon light had softened into a golden haze, slanting across the tables and catching in her hair, making it shine like strands of copper and honey. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud in my ears, as if it wanted to announce what I could not put into words. She stood close, just close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her. Her presence pressed against me in a way that was almost unbearable, magnetic, electric, irresistible. Every small gesture, the tilt of her head, the brush of her sleeve against my arm, the faint exhale of her breath, was amplified. I wanted to close the distance, but caution and fear held me in place. "Why do you keep looking at me like that?" she asked softly, almost a whisper, eyes searching mine. There was a tremor in her voice, a vulnerability she rarely showed, and it cut through me more sharply than any words of warning ever could. I swallowed, unable to find the right reply. "Like what?" I managed, though my voice betrayed me, rough and uneven. Like you're trying to memorize me," she said, stepping closer until I could feel the heat of her body, the gentle sway of her weight as she leaned slightly toward me. Her fingers lifted, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and my hand twitched, almost imperceptibly, as if drawn toward her face. The room seemed impossibly quiet, every tiny sound, her breath, the shuffle of her cardigan, the distant creak of the door, magnified. My pulse thundered in my chest. I was aware of every inch of her, every subtle curve and movement, yet acutely aware of the invisible barrier between us, propriety, age, fear of discovery. "I shouldn't," she started, her lips parting as though to say something more, but then her words faltered. She paused, eyes dark and searching, and I felt the weight of everything unspoken hanging between us. Desire, hesitation, longing, it was all suspended, a fragile thread neither of us dared sever. I stepped closer, careful, mindful of boundaries, but reckless in ways I hadn't been before. The scent of her, warm, faintly floral, washed over me. My hand rose, almost of its own accord, brushing a strand of hair from her face. She shivered slightly, though whether from the motion or the tension, I couldn't tell. Her eyes closed just a fraction, and I caught my breath, aware of how close we were. I whispered, my voice low, hoarse. "I can't stop noticing you." Her eyelids fluttered, and a faint, almost imperceptible smile tugged at her lips. She leaned slightly into my hand, a fleeting surrender, but pulled back just before our bodies could meet fully. My chest ached with a mixture of frustration and yearning, the intensity of the moment almost unbearable. "Do you have any idea how dangerous this is?" she breathed, so close that I could hear the rise and fall of her chest, the soft intake of her breath, the almost electric heat between us. "I don't care," I admitted, my voice breaking, raw with desire I could no longer contain. Her gaze met mine, and for a long heartbeat, we existed only in the space between us. The world outside, the rules, the age gap, all irrelevant, dissolved by the gravity of our attraction. I leaned in, slower this time, savoring the electric anticipation, the brush of her hair, the warmth of her shoulder against mine. My lips hovered near hers, and I could feel her own trembling, subtle, but unmistakable. Then she whispered, almost impossibly soft, "Don't." And in that single word, the room held its breath with us, poised on the edge of everything we'd denied ourselves. The day began like any other, the study hall still quiet except for the low murmur of pages turning. I thought we could keep our precarious equilibrium, the silent glances, the fleeting touches, the careful distance that made every brush of skin electric. But equilibrium is fragile, and today, it shattered. She was arranging books near the back when a folded slip of paper slipped from one of the shelves. I didn't notice it at first, but she did. Her eyes flicked downward, and then back at me, sharper than usual, filled with something I couldn't immediately place. Guilt? Surprise? Fear? "Did someone leave this here for you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light, but it trembled slightly. My fingers twitched, almost reaching for hers, but I held back, knowing better than to make the first move. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She bent down slowly, picked up the paper, and handed it to me. Our fingers brushed, just barely, but enough to make my pulse spike. She didn't look away, she met my eyes with that same careful, dangerous intent, and I realized she hadn't been expecting me to see it. "It's nothing," she said softly, but there was a hesitation in her tone, the slightest falter that betrayed the lie. Her fingers lingered a fraction too long near mine as she straightened, and my stomach clenched. I unfolded the paper. My eyes widened as I read a few words that weren't meant for me. Someone had confessed feelings for her. Someone had written about her the way I thought only I had. The slip was brief, but enough: the admiration, the longing, the claim that they were drawn to her in ways that mirrored everything I felt. I looked up at her. She was watching me carefully, as though trying to read my reaction, her shoulders tense, her lips parted slightly. Her breath brushed my cheek when she leaned forward, and I caught the faint scent of her perfume, warm and faintly floral, so dangerously close. She began, then stopped, biting her lip. She looked away for a moment, scanning the room as if the walls could speak our secret. I didn't expect you to see that." I swallowed hard, aware of how close we were. My hand itched to reach for hers, to brush away the tension, to close the impossible distance that had grown electric. She shifted subtly, leaning just slightly into me before pulling back, the movement so small it could have gone unnoticed, but I felt it in every nerve. It doesn't matter," I said, voice low, though every word trembled with the truth I couldn't hide. "It doesn't change anything here. Or—" I paused, letting the silence stretch between us, long and charged, as if the world had shrunk to just the space we occupied. She tilted her head, eyes wide, lips parted, her hand brushing past mine on the paper, fingers trembling. I felt the gravity between us shift, heavier, riskier, more urgent. Desire, fear, and something unspoken, maybe jealousy, maybe longing, pulled at every inch of my restraint. "You shouldn't," she whispered, voice low, almost breaking. "I mean, she faltered, as though the words themselves could undo everything. Her shoulder brushed mine, accidental, deliberate, I couldn't tell. I felt the heat of her body, the way her breath came in quick, shallow bursts. I stepped closer, our knees nearly touching under the table, and I let my voice drop to a whisper. "Why should I care what anyone else thinks?" Her eyes widened, a flicker of fear passing across her face, then something else, something that mirrored my own reckless want. She opened her mouth, closed it, and in the silence, our shared awareness of the risk was louder than words. Then she made a decision before I could, leaning forward, letting her hand rest, just barely, on the edge of mine. The spark between us ignited in an instant, dangerous and undeniable. The study hall seemed to contract around us. Outside, the world could continue, rules could persist, gossip could exist. But in this moment, there was only the heat, the tension, the brush of fingers, and the inevitable pull toward the point of no return. And I realized, with a mix of fear and elation, that neither of us would be able to resist much longer. The study hall had emptied completely. The late afternoon sun painted everything in amber, long shadows stretching across tables, floor, and walls. In that quiet, the air between us was almost unbearable, thick with anticipation, with every breath, every heartbeat magnified. She stood near the shelf, just a step away, and I realized how dangerously close we had drifted. Her eyes searched mine, hesitant, questioning, yet daring me to cross the invisible line we had danced around for weeks. The scent of her, soft, warm, floral, filled the space between us, intoxicating in its familiarity and in its impossibility. I stepped closer. The floor creaked faintly under my weight, and her hand lifted instinctively, as if to steady herself, though it hovered near my chest rather than gripping anything solid. Our knees brushed lightly beneath the table that had become our island of tension. My pulse thundered. Every nerve in my body screamed to reach for her, to close the tiny distance that had become a chasm of want. "You don't have to," she whispered, voice low, almost trembling. Her lips were parted slightly, her eyes searching mine for a decision I hadn't fully made. But I couldn't step back. Not now. Not when the weight of weeks, the longing, the hesitation, the forbidden gravity, pressed against me with such force. I raised my hand, slowly, almost painfully, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. She shivered at the touch, just barely, yet leaned toward it, the faintest surrender. "I can't," I admitted, my voice rough, low. "Not anymore." Her gaze softened, a mixture of relief, fear, and something more I couldn't name yet. She took a tiny, careful step closer, and our shoulders brushed. The simple contact was electric, a shock that made me aware of every inch of her, the warmth of her body, the subtle rise and fall of her chest, the faint scent that had haunted me since the first day I noticed her. Either can I," she whispered back. Her hand lifted, hovering near mine, then rested lightly over it, fingers trembling just enough to remind me that this was real, fragile, dangerous. For a long moment, we simply stood there, breathing in the same air, hearts thudding in imperfect synchrony. Words were unnecessary. The tension, the longing, the unsaid promises were enough. Every brush of our fingers, every hesitant step closer, spoke volumes. "I've waited, not knowing if you would notice me," I confessed quietly, letting my lips hover near her ear. The warmth of her skin made me shiver. "I've noticed," she breathed, her voice a whisper that trembled with vulnerability and desire. "Every single time." The truth hung between us like suspended gold. The choice had been made, though either of us had needed to speak it fully. The study hall, the world, the rules, all of it faded. There was only the pull, the gravity of each other, the surrender to something inevitable. We stepped closer, bodies just inches apart, and for a heartbeat, it felt like the world itself had paused. Her hand found mine fully, our fingers entwining almost instinctively. A laugh, soft and shaky, escaped her, and I realized how messy, human, and completely alive this moment was. "I understand you now," she whispered, her forehead resting lightly against mine. "All of you. And I you," I replied, voice low and raw, brushing my thumb across hers. The clarity between us was absolute. We had crossed the line, but in doing so, had found understanding, acceptance, and a fragile kind of peace. The sun dipped lower, and the shadows lengthened. Outside, the world continued, rules and judgments waiting. But inside that quiet study hall, we were no longer two people separated by hesitation, fear, or propriety. We were simply us, messy, imperfect, completely human, and utterly aware of each other. The study hall was quiet again, though the tension from earlier had transformed into something softer, warmer, a kind of peace neither of us had allowed ourselves before. The sun had dipped lower, spilling gentle amber across the wooden tables, and everything felt slowed down, intimate, suspended in golden light. She sat at the edge of a table, fingers brushing absent-mindedly over a book's spine. I approached slowly, careful not to disturb the fragile rhythm that had settled between us. Her gaze lifted, softening the moment the corners of her lips curled into that quiet smile I had memorized in the past weeks. Without a word, I slid onto the bench beside her. There was no need for grand gestures, no need for explanation. The distance that had defined us for so long, the social rules, the age gap, the fear of exposure, melted into irrelevance in that quiet space. Her hand found mine almost instinctively, fingers intertwining like pieces of a puzzle that had waited years to fit together. "You don't have to worry anymore," I murmured, voice low, letting the words carry everything I hadn't said before, the longing, the frustration, the quiet obsession of noticing her in ways no one else ever could. Her head tipped slightly toward me, resting near my shoulder. "I think I've been waiting for this for a long time," she said softly. The words were simple, but weighted with everything we had denied ourselves, the weeks of stolen glances, of near confessions, of electric touches that left us both breathless. We leaned closer, sharing the warmth of each other's presence. Her forehead brushed against mine in a gentle gesture that spoke of trust, acceptance, and the human vulnerability that had drawn me in from the first day. I closed my eyes for a moment, inhaling the familiar scent of her hair, the soft cadence of her breathing, the quiet pulse of her heartbeat beneath my hand. "You're incredible," I whispered, almost ashamed at how vulnerable I sounded. "I've never felt like this before." Her fingers tightened around mine, reassuring, grounding. "Neither have I," she admitted, her voice a soft tremor. "And yet, here we are." We laughed quietly, softly, the sound a release of all the tension, guilt, and hesitation that had shadowed our connection. Sitting there, side by side, I realized that this was more than desire. It was recognition, acceptance, intimacy in its most human form. No pretenses, no social judgment, just us and the fragile, beautiful truth of our feelings. We stayed that way for a long while, hands intertwined, shoulders brushing, occasionally exchanging small, quiet words. The world outside could keep spinning, but here, in the warm golden light, nothing else mattered. Every hesitation, every risk, every stolen glance had led to this, a quiet, messy, perfect understanding. Finally, she leaned fully against me, a content sigh escaping her lips. I rested my cheek against hers, fingers still entwined, and in that simple closeness, I felt clarity, peace, and a kind of joy I hadn't known I was missing. The age gap, the whispered fears, the weeks of longing, it all dissolved in the reality of being together, fully and unapologetically. We lingered there until the sun dipped completely below the horizon, the study hall empty and bathed in the warm glow of evening. No words were necessary. The quiet intimacy said everything we needed. And as I held her hand, feeling the pulse of life, desire, and trust intertwined, I realized that we had found something rare and enduring, each other. Did you enjoy the story? What kind of stories would you like to hear next?